All right, greetings everyone from Newark, Delaware. I'm Salim Ali. I'm a professor in the College of Earth, Ocean and Environment, as well as the Biden School of Public Policy at the University of Delaware. And I'm joined with four wonderful colleagues who will be presenting their ideas of what has been done innovatively in Delaware and also perhaps some areas of improvement. Now, in terms of the way we're going to handle things, I'd urge you to please keep yourself muted and also to keep your videos off to make sure we keep our bandwidth connections until you're ready to speak and ask questions. I'm also going to request you to use the chat feature generously because we'll be able to also keep a record of the conversations. Even if we don't have time to ask a question in real time, you will be able to have that recorded in the chat feature. All right, so with that, I'm going to introduce our first panelist, Dr. Joseph Nyangon, who is going to present some of his work based on his doctoral research as well as further work that he has done. He did his PhD at the University of Delaware, and he is currently also a postdoctoral associate with the university as well as with the Payne Institute at the Colorado School of Mines. He's also a TED Fellow. Those of you who are followers of the TED online videos, you'll note his affiliation there as well. So with that, Joe, over to you. And I'm going to share your PowerPoint momentarily, and you can start off with, there we go. Hopefully this will work. Share screen. And there we are.
So Salim, should I just click on my side?
Yeah, so I will go through because I have it saved. So I will go through, just let me know when you want to. Okay. I don't think you'll be able to because I'm showing it from my screen. All right.
Okay, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. And for those who will be watching the webinar recording, it is an absolute pleasure to share with you emerging clean energy innovations we are working on here in Delaware. As Salim has said, my name is Joe Nyangon, and I work here at the Center for Energy and Environmental Policy on a project funded by the US Department of Energy National Science Foundation grant and the Delaware General Assembly. In this project, we are collaborating with a number of universities, including Arizona State University, MIT, and the University of California, Merced. As the title of my presentation suggests, solar energy has emerged as a catalyst for meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement and the United Nations 2030 Agenda and its Sustainable Development Goals. Because solar is a very modular technology, it is helping clean energy innovations get to market faster. And the solar city strategy that we are presenting today is disrupting existing business models for financing, procuring, and constructing sustainable energy projects in cities. As we become more reliant on the technology that interconnects us, us to our jobs, to our families and pastimes, reliable, clean, and affordable electricity allows us to maintain those constant connections while making transformative climate responsive change in our energy system. And next slide. Fortunately, we have plenty of rooftop buildings here in Delaware, across the country, and indeed in other international cities on which to put solar panels. We have conducted research in a number of cities, including in New York, in London, in Amsterdam, in South Korea, in Tokyo, Japan, Philadelphia, and right here in Delaware's two main cities, Wilmington and Newark. And your city could be next. And even, no, sorry, okay. Still on the, yeah. And yeah, so as our presentation shows, we have also estimated the solar PV potential of the city of Seoul, as I was explaining earlier. And we have found that Seoul in South Korea has got sufficient power to actually cover its entire load during favorable moments when its solar energy city fabric can be exploited. And second, diverse policy efforts, notably state renewable portfolio standards and net metering policy, have also incentivized rooftop solar, as we had from the introductory video. And this has accelerated its growth in cities. In Delaware, for example, there are favorable energy policies in place, as well as other proposed legislations to support development of solar energy. For example, in Delaware was one of the early states to adopt net metering policies, which has been in place since 1999. Net metering policy allows solar developers to get full credit on their electric bill for the power they produce. As a result, in 2013, Delaware ranked 7th nationally on per capita level for rapid cumulative solar capacity. And third, as we heard from the introductory video, an important driver to the growth of solar in most states is a rapid decline in solar cost. This falling cost profile has significantly improved the economics of rooftop solar electricity, thereby making the investment case for widespread solar energy deployment attractive to investors, particularly when a utility scale is considered. In our analysis of financial feasibility of citywide solar PV deployment, we have found that most cities could deploy the solar city strategy under both existing conditions as well as considering other risk profiles. For instance, we have found that an average city has adequate rooftops capacity to supply nearly 30% of its annual electricity load. Now, next, let's look at the solar city model strategy. In brief, our research has been guided by the following question: how much rooftop space is available for solar PV, and how much electrical energy is generated by that rooftop area? And to answer this question, we have adopted an analytical approach that estimates the technical and economic potential of rooftop solar for the selected building. Assessing the technical potential of a city to deploy rooftop solar requires a series of datasets that together provide insights into the city's morphological and meteorological conditions. For instance, upon selecting a rooftop area, we use LiDAR, light detection and ranging data, for geographical information system rendering. We then determine the influence of shading to understand how shading affects the solar energy yield on the city's rooftops. Rooftops with insufficient yield are subsequently excluded from our analysis, and we also account for shading aspect and slope. And the result is the estimated technical potential of that building. And next, we run an estimated technical potential that we have established into an NREL system advisor model to calculate break-even solar power purchase price. And this gives us the estimated economic potential. Now, next, let's look at two practical applications, beginning with a project in Pennsylvania state. In Philadelphia, we have estimated a technical potential of 82 megawatts for city-owned buildings, out of which 50 megawatts account for flat rooftops. We estimate the cost of solar PV investment for city-owned buildings to be about $78 million, while that for flat rooftop is about $48 million. But this is only accounting for public-owned buildings. Our estimated citywide assessment for solar technical potential in Philadelphia yields about 4.7 gigawatts. Now, this is huge and could bring significant positive benefits, not just to Philadelphia, but also to its environs. Second, next, we have applied the same assessment in Delaware. Our analytical method has identified about 10,800 buildings with a total rooftop area of about 43 million square footage of suitable space across the entire city of Wilmington. Now, separated by property class, this available rooftop area amounts to about 90 megawatts for residential buildings, 75 megawatts for both public and commercial buildings, and 20 megawatts for industrial buildings. The total citywide rooftop PV technical potential of suitability, after accounting for suitability assessment for Wilmington, is about 260 megawatts. On the other hand, for NEWARK, we have identified about 8,100 buildings with a total rooftop area of about 24 million square footage of suitable space. When we separate this by property class, this available rooftop area amounts to about 65 megawatts for residential buildings, 48 megawatts for public buildings, and 32 megawatts for commercial buildings. And the estimated citywide rooftop PV technical potential for NEWARK is about 169 megawatts. Now, using Delaware's Sustainable Energy Utility, SEU, and each of the city's planning departments to design and manage the project with Delaware SEU financing, the solar city investment for all the buildings would be about $160 million for Newark City and about $250 million for Wilmington City, with a power purchase price of about paid by citizens and businesses of about 9.7 cents per kilowatt hour. Now, compared to the current average electricity price for both cities, which is about 12 cents per kilowatt hour, there's significant benefits as well there that we have established. Next. Now, another project in the solar cities domain we are currently developing here in Delaware involves the use of community solar. Community solar refers to a form of distributed solar generation facility that's located within close proximity to electricity users. Our research has investigated 14 states, including 6 leaders of community solar development, that is California, Massachusetts, Maryland, Minnesota, New Jersey, and New York. Community solar policies include LMI requirements, which seek to encourage participation of low-income consumers. We have also considered other elements of community solar which are important in this regard, and these include program structure, individual project sizes, subscriber location, subscriber eligibility, the value of the community solar to project users, as well as payment requirements. Now, in Delaware, the state has proposed to increase the renewable portfolio standard to 40% from renewable energy by the year 2030, and also to create community sustainable energy authorities for each city, town, and county, where basically to define and govern community solar deployment with investment facilitated by the Delaware SEU, or local government financing authorities. The Delaware SEU was created by Dr. Byrne, our next speaker, and Senator Harris McDowell, who represents the 1st District here in Delaware. And it represents an attempt to meet aggressive and transformative goal for sustainable energy future in Delaware. The principal difference between the Delaware's SEU and a public benefit fund, for instance, is that an SEU accrues revenue through shared energy savings. An SEU also functions as a community utility, which is directly accountable to the local community because the projects are situated closely to consumers, and it serves as it seeks to deliver sustainable energy services. One of the achievements of the Delaware SEU, just to highlight, has been catapulting Delaware into a top 10 ranked state nationally on a per capita level for rapid cumulative solar installation. This is very important to the future of energy sustainability, as we had in the introductory video, and also to our climate goals, as you will hear from Dr. Byrne, our next speaker. And to conclude next, as we have documented in our research publications, cities have the potential to embark on a vigorous sustainable energy pathway that exceeds their current obligations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nyangon, for that very informative presentation. We will move on directly to our next speaker, who has been partially introduced, and many of you, of course, will know Professor John Byrne, who is the founder of the Center for Energy and Environmental Policy at the University of Delaware, as well as the founder of the Energy and Environmental Policy graduate program that was one of the first on the East Coast in the US in terms of graduate education in this area. Dr. Byrne is distinguished professor within the Biden School of Public Policy, and as noted, he has worked for many years with the state of Delaware in improving energy performance. He's also an alumnus of the University of Delaware at multiple levels. So thank you very much, Dr. Byrne, for joining. So I'm going to let you start off with sharing your screen, because you have your PowerPoint on your screen, and we're good to go.
Thanks very much, Salim, and thank you, Joe, and thanks everyone for joining us. I think it's a special time for us to discuss fundamental problems like this, living in this era of a virus, and that's very threatening to us. As even from Bard College mentioned, the climate crisis we face happens in a way that is more insidious and maybe not as well recognized every day as what we are unfortunately experiencing with the coronavirus. But the need to climb down from an extraordinarily high level of carbon emissions by the human population, and to do that quickly in order to make life livable, both for us in the near term and in the long term, is essential. So I've worked a long time in this field, and I just wanted to briefly, in the spirit of the webinar's effort to combine sustainability and justice issues, I simply wanted to complement what Joe has said by giving you a few remarks on the justice side of this. And I think that's important because it has been a problem for us. We've negotiated for nearly 20 years at the global level and could not get significant movement on the sustainability question. And many who went through that experience believe that a key reason for that is the failure to put in another core value in the definition of the pathway for our future. And that missing value is climate justice. And it's something that's found readily. You can see it in our state of Delaware. If you just compare the first quintile and what it pays for basic electricity use against the fifth quintile, you can see readily you have an inequality of roughly an order of 14 in magnitude, as low-income families have to make difficult choices between the basic electricity service. This is not a large consumption. This is just what is thought to be the basic requirements in a household in the modern era. And so that difficulty actually embeds poverty in these communities, because without that electrical service, a lot of other opportunities are not available. And it's something that we live with every day. The moderate income families are not always facing the poverty directly that in the second quintile that the first do, but still it's a major risk, and difficult choices must be made in order just to conduct daily life, while other quintiles do not face this. So we live with this kind of insidious, embedded injustice in our community. We have roughly 100,000 households out of the 370,000 in the state that face this problem. And of course, this is not a problem. You can find it in every state. And because of its origins in the transformation of the atmosphere, you can find it everywhere in the world. And one of the practical implications of that is that we have created a world of carbon excess provided by the wealthiest countries in the world. Our planet came with the ability to absorb about 3.3 tons per person per year at 1990 populations. This graph shows you where we are against that metric, and the width of these show you the proportion of the world's population that are in those individual countries. And as you can see, the greatest part of this problem comes from the wealthy world, and often the brunt of the disaster that comes with climate change is borne by the rest of the world that has little to do with the causes of this problem. So we have this problem. It is a basic injustice that we have to cure. I think after the experience of 20 years of negotiation at the international level, that without adding climate justice in, you're not going to get an all-in opportunity. But I think also, and why I think even in Bard College have been very thoughtful in their development of this webinar, much of that momentum to make that happen is not going to happen in the negotiators at the international meetings. Much of that momentum is actually in the communities themselves. I can't spend time here, unfortunately, showing you, but if you look at both the targets and the achievements of our local communities, our cities, our towns, our counties, our states, they almost always in the US and around the world beat what is the national policy or the national strategy in this regard. It's much more likely that we're going to get significant movement and transformation if local communities take on this challenge. So far, they are trying, and one of the challenges that is very important in those communities when you listen to those discussions and those narratives is to solve the problem of justice with the problem of sustainability. So in that spirit, I just want to give you a sense of where the problem exists and why the IPCC is indicating, a body that I've worked with for a long time, why it is indicating that we need to make transformative change and not incremental change. This is a busy graph. I'm not expecting you to understand all of it necessarily, but let me try and summarize the point. It's the work of my colleague Juhee Lee, who looked at the problem that South Korea faced by going with the sort of traditional modern energy system solution to a problem. In this case, to use nuclear power in the premise that somehow it would reduce carbon emissions. But in so doing, it has now embedded a deep social injustice in the society. The lower graph shows you the counties that are the relatively moderate and low-income counties gathered along the left bottom part of the graph, and the counties that are well-to-do and do most of the electricity consumption are in that flat line at the top. There is just two distinct communities in Korea this way, and if you do the more generic problem of development and the way the energy system is devised, again, you can see most of the burden and the risk, who is approximate to those plants, who will suffer from the accidents, and who, even if there are no accidents, will suffer from the suppressed economic possibilities because of these plants. This is part of what is the deeper injustice that is built into the existing system. Compensation cannot solve this problem. There is really only one way to solve this problem, and that is to move rapidly away from it and to move toward the kind of suggestions that Joe made, and I'm sure Cristina and my colleagues, Phil, will make in just a moment. On that note, can we get there? Is there a way to make this all work? This is briefly an indication of what those communities that I mentioned have done compared to national efforts. The national efforts list the major national carbon reduction bills introduced in the US since 2002 or 2001. And against those, none of which were passed, against those are the steady progress that the local governments and local communities have made, creating net metering so that what you pay for electricity is what you receive if you inject clean, renewable energy into the grid. And a critical early tool created by our states and cities, not by the federal government in the US case. Similarly, the RPS setting not simply goals and standards, but also obliging the utility sector to invest in these new technologies. Currently in Delaware, about $3.5 to $4.5 million are invested each year in wind technologies, and another $5 to $7 million are invested through the RPS in the development of solar technologies. We also have an energy efficiency resource standard, which requires the utilities to actually reduce consumption over time, not increase, not slow down the rate of increase, but to actually decrease the volume of electricity use by making our services what we want rather than simply selling us electricity. And when you look at that picture, I just offer that this is the opportunity. These are the drivers in a society like the US. Delaware, I'm pleased to say, has every single one of these major policy options, including green financing, which Joe mentioned through the SEU. And I think with the development of a community solar program that is being actively discussed in the Senate under the leadership of Senator Harris McDowell, I think there is the possibility for us to move even faster than what we have in the past. We will have to. And I think it is possible because communities, at the end of the day, have solved the question of how to build interest and how to build momentum in going forward. I just hope, and I know in the case of the community solar efforts that are going on now, I just hope that we take what the UN motto gave us for this regard, which is build this new future with sustainability for all. We didn't do at all well in the previous round of building an energy system. We must do better, not only in terms of sustainability, but in terms of climate justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, JB, for that great encapsulation of climate justice, both within Delaware as well as across the miles in South Korea. I would alert you to a few questions which are coming up in the chat room. So both Joe and yourself may want to address those in the chat room, and you may want to mute yourself while you do that so the clicking of your keyboard does not come into the audio. Wonderful. So moving on now from solar and climate justice, we move to wind, and we're very pleased to have with us Dr. Cristina Archer, who is a professor in the College of Earth, Ocean and Environment, and she is also had an affiliation in engineering. She's trained as an engineer, did her doctorate at Stanford, and then joined UD many years ago. So she is very much a Delawarean, and she's also originally from Italy, and can perhaps also bring into the conversation some aspects of comparisons which may be appropriate or that may come up in the subsequent conversations in the chat room. So I'm going to share her presentation. Hopefully it is visible now. So over to you, Dr. Archer.
Thank you, Salim. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, and thank you everybody. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk about my favorite things in the world. So I will be talking about offshore wind power and a vehicle to grid, acronym V2G. And you might wonder, why am I talking about these two things? Well, this is all about Delaware and climate change. And our biggest threat in terms of climate change in Delaware is actually sea level rise. So we Delawareans are the second lowest lying state in the country after Louisiana. So sea level rise is a serious threat for us. And so we need to do something about it. And transportation as well as electricity generation are the largest contributions to CO2 emissions in the country, actually. And so if we want to fight climate change, it kind of makes sense to start acting on these two major sources. Again, electricity generation and transportation. So if you want to step away from fossil fuels in electricity generation, that's where wind comes in very handy. And Delaware being a coastal state, we don't have mountains, we don't have a lot of wind inland, but boy, we have a lot of offshore wind. So offshore wind is really a wonderful resource for us. And when you're looking at emissions from transportation, again, it's burning of diesel and gasoline. So if you can switch to electric vehicles and then have this wonderful V2G technique, then you're set. So I'm going to have a lot of figures and photos in my presentation, and the next one shown here is about these incredible turbines that we're going to have in the next few years, and they're really technological marvels. If you look at the picture on the upper right corner, that is the hub of the new GE Haliade X turbine. This is a 12 megawatt machine. It's so large. I mean, look at the comparison between all those people at the bottom of just the hub to give you an idea of how majestic these turbines really are. An example of a delivery of a blade is in the picture in the lower right corner. And this is going through a small French village to deliver the blades to a nearby farm. And I can only imagine what would happen, on a bad turn or when there's a bridge. So the delivery of even the blades is actually complicated because the machines are so large. The figure in the center shows you some kind of a visual comparison about how tall they are. So if you stay inland, basically the tallest turbine that you can find is on the order of 600 feet or less from the bottom to the very tip, the top of the tip when it's in the the vertical position. And so, the Statue of Liberty is a baby compared to the inland turbines. When you go offshore, well, everything gets even bigger. And the reason why is mainly it's so complicated to build offshore that the bigger you can do it, the better it is, because you have less trips and you can extract more power from one position, one turbine, as opposed to having to build multiple of them. So not surprisingly, the largest turbines are going to be offshore. And so the Haliade X, which is a GE, so it's an American turbine, is going to be probably, so far is going to be the biggest, 12 megawatts. It's really an incredible amount of power. And the blades are over 100 meters in length each. So it's really incredible. If we go to the next slide, I'm going to try to convince you about why offshore wind is so, it makes so much sense for us on the East Coast. And these two figures show you the distribution of wind speed on the left and capacity factor on the right along the shore. And the numbers, they're amazing. This is an average wind speed over a year in general. And offshore of Delaware, you can see these red coral color, which is 8 meters per second or higher on average, which is really remarkable. The capacity factor, which is basically tells you out of 100%, if a turbine was producing 100% of what it can, what does it produce actually on average? And over land, we go between 20 to 30% capacity factors. But here offshore, especially offshore of Delaware, easily we can get into the 40 and 45% capacity factors. So these are really very high. And the value of wind speed that I mentioned, 8.5 meters per second, maybe you can't really grasp how much it is. But in that link that I'm showing you, the Global Wind Atlas, if you click on it, and if you, Salim can go to the next slide, I'm going to show you an example of what that looks like. Oh, you have the older version of my PowerPoint. Okay, never mind. You have to go there on your own. If you can please go back. Yeah, sorry. It would have been very nice to compare how smooth and powerful the wind is offshore versus how much less it is over the land. And over land, it's much more sensitive to mountains and things like that. But in Delaware, basically, the inland resource is nothing compared to the offshore resource. So we have high winds, high capacity factors, shallow bathymetry. I almost forgot to mention that. The continental shelf is not very deep, and the geology is also very favorable for offshore wind. And even more important, it's the proximity to a lot of large urban centers and big cities. So it's obviously an excellent position where we are. And not surprisingly, in the next slide, you can see the various leases that BOEM, which is the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, it's part of the U.S. Department of the Interior. It's the entity in charge of leasing out these areas for development for offshore wind. And the ones that I'm showing here on the East Coast and the West Coast are the current active or planned leases that are going on. And as you can see, hopefully there's a couple of them that are right offshore of Delaware. Skipjack and US Wind are their names, and I'll talk about them a little more very soon. In the US, we only have one existing operational wind farm at Block Island. It's 30 megawatts, and it's only 5 turbines. But there are 25 gigawatts that are planned. So 30 megawatts installed today, 25,000 planned for the next few years. So this is a booming industry. It's an incredible development, and it's very exciting to be here and to do offshore wind in Delaware. 7 states are already on board, from Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New York. I wish I could say Delaware was one of them. We are not. So that's something that we can really, we should really be thinking about a little more, and try to have more development in Delaware. But also in terms of the developers, we now have big names coming in. Ørsted, even Avangrid, US Wind, they're coming in with money, and you know, it's becoming a real serious industry. If we go to the next slide, I'm going to zoom in a little bit to Delaware and Maryland, actually, our neighbor. And these are the 2 wind lease energy areas that are relevant to us, Skipjack and US Wind. They're going to happen soon. And both of them are going to be using the GE Haliade X turbine that I mentioned earlier. Should I answer questions now, Celine?
Sorry, no, not right now. Yes, please make sure everyone mutes their audio while yes. All right, go ahead.
Yeah. So when you have a leased area and you build your turbines offshore, the little schematic at the bottom of the slide shows you how it would work. Basically, it shows that you have to have the cable going to the bottom of the ocean and connect to the grid inland. So you have to build all of this as part of the wind farm project that you're going to propose. And so connecting to the land is one of the issues that are interesting, because of course the developers want to spend as little money as possible in doing this, because this means cheaper prices for everybody. But at the same time, you know, the communities may or may not like that the big cables come onshore in their community. If we go to the next slide, I have a couple of photos of our own turbine at the University of Delaware. We are the only operational turbine, large scale turbine in Delaware, and we've been operational since 2011 or 2010. And so these are some photos of, you know, the foundation building and the construction phase when the hub was delivered. And this beautiful photo shows the turbine as it is. Actually, it was a few years ago in our marine campus in Lewis. And at the link that I show here, you can follow the real-time production of wind energy from our turbine. So this is very exciting. I'm ready now to switch to the vehicle to grid, which is maybe something you're less familiar with. And V2G is entirely the idea of Dr. Willett Kempton, who's one of our faculty here at UD. And the main reason behind V2G, which I know you don't know what it is yet, it's coming, but I have to tell you that the main reason why we are interested in it is storage. Storage is expensive. V2G can do storage for a very, very low cost. So it's an incredible opportunity for Delaware to do this. And a couple of facts to build up to V2G are that in the US, we have a lot of cars. I looked up this value on Wikipedia a few minutes ago, 275 million cars in the US. Crazy, crazy. There are a lot of cars. And actually already 1 million of electric vehicles. That's actually kind of promising as well. And all these cars, I can promise you, 95% of the time they are sitting somewhere, either in your garage, either in the parking lot where you work. On average, we drive 5% of the time and park 95%. So while the vehicle is parked, and especially if it's an electric vehicle and has a battery, guess what? That battery is a micro storage unit. And if you put all of these cars together, you actually have a significant storage system, potential storage system in place. Why? Because the electric vehicles already have a battery. You don't have to purchase it, and they already have conversion equipment on board. So it's a very cheap solution as well. And so the beauty is that vehicles and cars, which are one of the main causes of climate change and CO2 emissions, now become part of the solution as opposed to being just the problem. So let's take a look at how it works in the next slide. So the first step is that you have an electric car. So it has to be an electric car with a relatively large battery. And you're in the red, which it's not very fun when it gets red. It means that you have to charge. So you want to charge your car. You have a vehicle to grid system on board, which you still don't know exactly what it is. But when you want to charge your car, you can go to any charger and it works exactly as it's always worked. You plug it in and electricity comes from the grid to your battery. Next step is that now you have your full battery and it's ready for you to do whatever you want. And one of the things that you might want to do in the next slide is to actually dedicate some of that charge that you have in your battery, some of it, not all of it, and you decide how much. You can let some of that charge go into the grid for two reasons. One could be to make money, literally. You sell that electricity back to the grid at a cost, so you can make money that way. Or you can actually save costs to yourself if you go back to your home and release that electricity into your house so that you don't have to actually purchase electricity later. So no matter what, you decide how much you want to give out, and with the rest, you can drive as you wanted before. And all of this in the future, in an upcoming future, hopefully soon, will be done via an app. So you can be on the market, decide how much you're willing to to sell, and how much you want to keep for your driving trip. So in the next slide, I want to show you briefly why this makes so much sense. And again, storage is the reason, and storage is expensive. This slide has a lot of data that I actually didn't calculate. A software did this for my colleague, Dr. Kempton, but it shows you the capital cost that you need to invest if you want to have a battery, or let's say a battery, a storage of some sort. And it's very expensive, and obviously it's more expensive for residential and small commercial batteries, and it's cheaper and cheaper as the scale goes up. So on the x-axis here, we have capital cost getting larger and larger. And on the y-axis, we have a bunch of types of batteries that you can have: lithium ion, lead, advanced lead, whatever it is. Let's not worry about that. But the cheapest thing you can find on this plot is basically $1,000 per kilowatt. That's the cheapest storage that you can find. And then if you're starting to do V2G in the next slide, this is what the cost of V2G would be. And this is just one value that I'm showing, two values actually. The red is what has already been proven in demo projects with the V2G demos, and it's order of $227 per kilowatt. And these have to do with a few minor changes that you have to do to the vehicles to allow for the electric charge to actually be released from the car to the grid, not only received, but also released. And so in demo projects, which as you can imagine are more expensive because you have a limited number of cars, because the technology is new, because you're testing, the cost is $227. And it's projected to be order of $45 per kilowatt. So again, the cheapest form of storage you can find today is order of $1,100 per kilowatt, and only if you're like a large utility. So this is basically the last slide I have, and hopefully I can take some questions later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Archer. And also, because you've covered some of the work of Dr. Kempton, I should acknowledge him as well, and I hope that others who are interested in V2G can connect with him. This is very much a Delaware innovation that is now being upscaled also in other parts of the world. All right, so as noted before, we are going to try and do the questions in the chat room. So I would urge those of you who have questions also for Dr. Archer to please type in your questions. And there's one already for you there. So that should be great. Now we're going to move on to our final presenter, last but not least, Dr. Phil Barnes, who is in the faculty of the Byrne School of Public Policy and Administration at UD. And he has been also working actively at many levels around climate policy within the state of Delaware. And he will tell you more about some of his work therein. But suffice it to say, he's someone who has great knowledge of the state at multiple levels. So I'm going to share his presentation, and similarly, please let me know as well, Phil, when you want to advance the slides. Everyone can view the presentation there. There we go.
Okay, thank you, Salim, for organizing. Thank you, everybody, for attending this Power Dialog. Thank you to Bard College for putting this on. Happy to talk about some of the issues surrounding sea level rise. So Cristina mentioned it at the beginning of her talk, and I would agree, the biggest threat to Delaware going forward is certainly going to be sea level rise and its impact on the state. So the first three presentations that you've heard today all address this issue of climate mitigation, where we are trying to reduce our carbon emissions and decarbonize our economies. This talk will be about climate adaptation, where we essentially assume that some impact from climate change is unavoidable, and we have to deal with that in the way that is most appropriate. So right now, as Cristina said, Delaware is a lowest lying state. You've heard this multiple times, and so we are relatively flat as well. So we are a coastal state, and this is something that that the state of Delaware has to contend with over the next several decades. In fact, not even several decades, but now. So what exactly is the challenge? Thank you, Salim. What exactly is the challenge? Challenge is sea level rise, and some modeling. I saw that John Callahan is on this call right now, and he is the one who actually put together this graph, so maybe he should jump on and explain it. He'd do a better job than I can, but these are the most recent projections for sea level rise in Delaware. The red line, the high line there, is if we essentially maintain our high emissions scenario. The green line is a moderate scenario, and the blue line is a low emissions scenario. So you can see, even with a low emission scenario, by the end of the century, we are looking at least a half a meter, so about a foot and a half, about a foot and a half of sea level rise by the end of this century. So My understanding is that currently we are on the high emissions scenario, that we will, unless we significantly decarbonize and do many of the things that the previous presenters talked about and more, in addition, transportation, we haven't even really mentioned transportation, which accounts for approximately 40% of Delaware's, the nation's, and global emissions. We are not going to get to that low emission scenario. So this is something that we need to be prepared for, and we need to start preparing for. So next slide, please. One of the other things that happened in 2017 was modeling about what the impact of sea level rise will be. So these are maps that are publicly available. You can go to first map, which is Delaware's GIS service, and you can play around with these maps. They are available online, and they model sea level rise inundation up in increments of 1 foot up to 7 feet. So anybody who's got a good geography, knowledge of geography in Delaware will recognize this location as South Bethany. The orange layers there is a 3 foot sea level rise. So this is what we are looking at by the end of the century at a low emission scenario. So 3 feet, and you can see there in South Bethany, those canals on the Back Bay side and the marsh side, most of those homes will be permanently inundated. Now, something that I have to acknowledge here is that these models do not account for precipitation. So this is only permanent inundation from a rise in sea level. We know, unfortunately, that Delaware floods currently without even a 3 feet of sea level rise because all of the development that has happened, runoff, flatness of the land, in addition to our proximity to these tidal water bodies. And so we already experience flooding. In fact, there was and when you add flooding, when you add precipitation events onto the sea level rise, these maps look even more concerning. Some analyses that have been done, one of the issues with climate change impacts is the frequency and intensity of heavy precipitation events that we will have here in the state. And by the end of the century, that 1 in 100 year flood, which happens 1 in 100 years now, is going to happen basically every year. It will be an annual flood by the end of the century when we account for the enhanced precipitation and the sea level. So this is something that we have to do. So moving forward, next slide, please. What can we do? So there are things that we can do, and here is a typology of different sea level rise adaptation strategies. So what can municipalities and states do to deal with this threat? There's essentially four different strategies that can be pursued depending on context and depending on resources and whatnot. You can pursue different strategies. So the first strategy is protect. So this is something that basically we hard engineer a shoreline or some type of public works project to prevent flooding and damage from sea level rise. Another strategy is to accommodate. So these are things that we can do to our existing assets that allow them to be inundated, but reduce their vulnerability and damage to sea level impacts. The third strategy is avoiding. So if we have areas that are currently undeveloped, we don't have to develop them. We can actually avoid placing critical infrastructure properties in vulnerable areas. And finally, the fourth, and perhaps the most hardest, as you go down in these, as you go down the page here, strategies get progressively more difficult to achieve. The fourth and final strategy is retreat. So this is a situation where you have assets adjacent to the sea, they are under threat, and you essentially relocate and get out of the way and let nature take its course. So these are the different strategies, and thankfully we've pursued all four of these to greater or lesser extent here in Delaware. So this is Newcastle, our protect strategy, where we're essentially hard engineering. This is maybe one of the first public works projects, European-led public works projects in the state of Delaware, right? The Dutch arrived, and as the Dutch are wont to do, they started building dikes. So in the mid-17th century, in Newcastle, these dikes were built. and they're still there, and they're still performing their function for the city of Newcastle. Next slide. Another thing that we are doing currently in Delaware is beach replenishment. So you're all familiar with this practice. If you are from the state, right? What we do is we take sand, dredge it from offshore, and we pump it onshore. So we replenish our dunes, we build our dunes back up, we extend the beaches out into the water. I'm not passing judgment on the effectiveness or the efficiency or the cost effectiveness of any of these policies. I'm simply highlighting, because I know some of these things are controversial, I'm simply highlighting strategies that we have undertaken here in Delaware. Next slide. So accommodate. So how do we deal with some of our existing assets, and how do we accommodate sea level rise impacts? One of the most prominent ways to do that at the local level is through what's called a freeboard, and that is in your local floodplain ordinance. So if you have floodplains in your municipality, all municipalities are required to have a floodplain ordinance. And in that ordinance, it defines what's called freeboard, and this is a dimension above the maximum flood height for a 1 in 100, the flood height for a 1 in 100 year storm, at which you are able to build your ground level. So if your flood level is here in the floodplain and your freeboard is 6 inches, that means you must build your lowest ground floor 6 inches above your flood level. So this is like a safety factor that municipalities identify within their floodplain ordinances. So if the flood is worse than the 100 year, your home is not completely inundated. These dimensions vary across the state. There are some municipalities that have 0 freeboard, meaning you are allowed to build a new construction right at the base flood level, up to, for example, 2 feet. So in some municipalities, I was talking with the city planner of Ocean View earlier today on the phone, and their freeboard is 2 feet in Ocean View, which is a very good number. Next slide. Another system of accommodation we could identify as South Wilmington's Wetland Park. So this is an area that frequently floods. It actually maybe this would be better for the avoid category of the typology, but essentially the South Wilmington's Wetlands Park is an area in South Wilmington where the flood runoff from South Wilmington flows into this area. It also accommodates sea level rise, and this will be a okay. This will be an amenity for the South Wilmington area. Next slide. We have a similar park in Laurel. So on the Broad Creek in Laurel, it's actually called Tidewater Park. And this is an area, this is looking from the creek into Laurel. If I turned around, you would see Broad Creek. It's a tidal creek in Laurel in southwestern Delaware. And this is an area that's remained undeveloped, and they're putting a playground there. So this is a low impact development. So if it gets inundated, you're not damaging critical infrastructure or community assets. The avoid situation, I can highlight Bethany Beach here. Bethany Beach purchased a 12-acre parcel, I believe, to turn it into the Bethany Beach Nature Center. So this was a wetlands area within the municipal boundaries of Bethany Beach, and they saw that development of this area would be damaged, sensitive, ecologically sensitive area, and they thought, let's also provide an amenity for residents and visitors. They went ahead and purchased the property and turned it into a nature center, therefore avoiding any development on this parcel. Next slide. The retreat option, I've only got one really good example here. This is in Bowers Beach, where there was a chronically flooded property, and the state worked with DEMA, so Delaware Emergency Management Agency, and FEMA, which funded a buyout of this property. The property owners sold it to the municipality with funding from FEMA. And the municipality turned it into, again, they turned it when, as a part of the stipulations for this program, if you get bought out, you cannot redevelop the property. And so the municipality effectively turned it into a bocce court for the community. These are all ad hoc measures that sort of happen around the state. Here and there, DEMA might get involved, DNREC might get involved, the local municipalities might get involved. So there's a lot of, it's sort of a patchwork effort. Unfortunately, for Delaware, we do not have a state-led, and I mean from the administrative side of the state, we do not have a state-led coordinated sea level rise adaptation plan. This is something that DNREC has talked about doing. I know DNREC is currently involved in developing a climate mitigation plan for the state, and there is conversation about developing an adaptation plan to go along with it. But right now, we do not have in the state of Delaware a statewide sea level rise adaptation plan. We have vulnerability assessments and we sort of know what's going on, but we don't have a coordinated effort. And so stepping into that void is a group that's called RASCL. Some of you on the call might be familiar with this. This is the Resilient and Sustainable Communities League. This was started 5 years ago by myself and Susan Love, Mike Bolstrip, who's on the call. I saw Kelly Valencic and Danielle Swallow. And the group of us got together to try to talk to and coordinate our efforts with state partners. And I just pulled up the agenda, the agenda for our first meeting back in August 13th, 2015. And before it was called RASCL, which is Resilient and Sustainable Communities League, which is essentially a grouping of state agencies that are working on this issue, state partners, so Office of State Planning Coordination, D-Grant, various divisions within DNREC, Institute for Public Administration, Bayshore, some nonprofits. We're all sort of coordinating our efforts to assist local governments to become more resilient and sustainable. We came up with this acronym, Resilient and Sustainable Communities League, and I'm looking at our very first agenda for our very first meeting back in August 13th, 2015. We called ourselves Delaware's Climate Change, Resiliency, and Sustainable Community Partner Planning Coordination Meeting, which is a mouthful. We are now called RASCL. So it rolls off the tongue a little bit better. So this is something that actually has received some recognition around the country as being sort of a model to emulate, that in the absence of coordinated top-down management, that the various agencies and the partners around the state that assist and provide technical assistance, financial assistance, resources to local governments actually coordinate their own efforts to ensure that they're not duplicating and that they're being effective in how they reach out to the local leaders. So that's it.
Okay, thank you very much, Phil. Clearly, just 1 second, have we got everyone back on regular Zoom? Okay, wonderful. So clearly, Phil has been an innovator at the community level with the establishment of RASCL. That could be one of the innovations that we highlight. We've been asked to highlight 3 innovations or solutions that Delaware can present to the rest of the country and to the world. Community solar, I think, was another one that was noted, and the work that Dr. Byrne did with the state initially to try and develop a utility interface with the solar power sector would perhaps be one. I'm just seeding these ideas as we open up for conversation. And then on the wind power side, V2G may be another one, which is a Delaware-based innovation. I'm not sure how much of it is being actually done in Delaware, because I know the company is in Denmark and they're doing work in Europe, but that may be something we can discuss. So we have about 20 minutes for discussion. given the number of people who are online, I have muted everyone. I was trying to not do the gag on my end, but I had to because we were getting some background noise. But I can unmute anyone who would like to chat. There is a feature in Zoom which allows you to raise your hand. Or if you don't know how to do that, you can just type and say, I want to ask a question on the air, or you can type your question on the chat feature, and we can ask that at the plenary level. So I'm going to unmute our panelists and then open it up for a conversation therein. I should also note that the Dean of the College of Earth, Ocean and Environment, Dr. Estela Tequana, is also on the call. And to thank her for her participation, I wanted to also give her a chance if she had any particular question or comment up front to say so as well. So if Dr. Tequana would like to ask a question or make a comment, we'd be delighted, but I'm also unmuting the other panelists.
Hi, Salim, and thank you for giving me this opportunity. Usually you have to be very careful if you're a dean and you show up in a place like this, then they ask you to say something, which I wasn't really planning on saying anything, but I'm really impressed with the climate research efforts that are going on our campus. And sometimes from where I sit, it's difficult to see all of these things. And so I really wanted to join this panel, your panelists today, to learn more about what UD has been doing and the state of Delaware has been doing. And as you know, climate change is one of the initiatives that is being highlighted in our new strategic plan. So if you get a chance, please go to the college website, and the plan is brand new. And we do have a climate initiative that we will be launching this year. And many of you on this platform right now have volunteered to participate to help amplify the climate research that is being done, at the University of Delaware. And I just want to say thank you to all the presenters today. It was really great hearing from all of you, and I really enjoyed learning a whole lot about the climate initiatives that's going on our campus. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tequana. All right, so we are open for questions and conversations. We have some points which are being raised in the chat room. I have unmuted all of our panelists also, if they would like to make any comments themselves as well. So I think Catherine said she wanted to ask a question. I can unmute Catherine if she'd like to ask a question. Catherine?
Hi, everybody. I just wanted to know, where is the raise your hand button?
Yes, yeah. Yes, it's in the participant list. If you go to the participant list, and there's a way to raise your hand at the bottom. There's a little hand which should show up there. But since you have the floor, you're welcome to ask a question.
Okay, and then that's fine. I'm not seeing that, but I'll look for that later. I wanted to ask really, really early on in the talk about how there's a very big difference between what people who are, first of all, I'm not a scientist, so I'm just very interested. Why people who are poor pay more for energy than people who are rich.
So Dr. Byrne, this may be for you to address, given you gave
when we're talking about social justice. I don't understand that. So sorry. Yeah.
No, I saw your question. I tried to on chat, so I tried to answer on chat as well. But that's another whole. But anyway, the graph is intended to show you what is the income effort that a family needs to make in order to pay for the basic services, basic electricity services needed in the home. And basic electricity services are normally defined as something in the vicinity of around 1,000 kilowatt hours or 800 kilowatt hours per month. and you then take the price that everyone pays for that electricity, multiplied by that basic electricity need for a household today, and then you're going to divide it by the income of the household.
Gotcha. Yeah. So it's based on income versus that it costs a poor person.
That's correct. It's not the price that changes. It's the amount of effort that a family needs to make just to have basic services. So.
Yes, we have another follow-up question around the acronyms, the NEMERS.
Yes. I apparently went too fast on some of this, and I'm really sorry about that. So the major innovations of the states and localities in the U.S. are NEM, net electricity metering, which means this applies to wind, it applies to solar. If you participate in a program that builds that technology, you will then be, in terms of your bill will fall by an amount equal to what you pay for that electricity normally from the grid. That parity creates the conditions for folks to actually use the electricity to lower the solar electricity or wind electricity to lower their bills. And in the slide that Joe showed on Wilmington and on NEWARK, if you were to build, for example, a pool that would take the public buildings, we've been in discussion with the city of Wilmington and with the city of NEWARK about using their own public buildings as the hosts for this sort of approach, so-called Solar Cities approach. They would then actually see their bills go down because they would be offset by that amount of electricity that was being generated by the system. They would in turn pay a developer a price that currently is about 3 cents per kilowatt hour less. So you don't need to be a scientist. What it basically is if you go today into these new approaches, you actually will pay less for electricity than if you stay on the grid. And those opportunities are why solar cities are becoming very powerful, very popular around the world. The additional, just very quickly, RPS, Renewable Portfolio Standard, the state sets a schedule of what percentage that the utility must acquire from its customers for different renewable energy sources. And that requirement is backed up by a market called the Renewable Energy Credits Market, where the utility offers a payment for those renewable energy consumption that would come through that new program. And those renewable energy credits currently provide about an annual investment in solar of about $6 to $7 million a year, and currently for wind at about $3.5 to $5 million a year. So that's what RPS is, and it's been a very important second major driver in moving us toward a what Phil said is, at least from a mitigation standpoint, reducing the CO2 that we put into the atmosphere. The third was an Energy Efficiency Resource Standard, EERS. Energy Efficiency Resource Standard basically requires the utilities to reduce the amount of electricity they sell. And the way to do that is to buy through energy efficiency and renewable energy to buy down the amount of grid electricity that needs to be provided. Again, that approach helps us to accelerate the development of these sustainable energy options. And the last one, and I'm really sorry, I didn't even mention it in my talk, Public Benefits Fund used to be, it's not so frequently used any longer, it was a subsidy. It was a subsidy that came out of state government that paid like a down payment for you to begin to make an investment in solar energy or in wind
wonderful.
energy.
So thank you so much. Now, there are lots of other questions which are coming up in the chat feature. Please, the panelists, go to the chat feature to try and address some of them. For the remaining 10 minutes, I also wanted to note that we have members from the state government also part of the audience. If they have any points they would like to make, and also the last 10 minutes I would like to spend on getting consensus on these three key innovations. I mentioned some, but if there are others that the participants would like to bring up, you have an opportunity to do so. You can type them in the chat room. I have also, again, given an opportunity for people to unmute if they want to and speak up. But please, be careful that there's not too much background noise. All right. So anyone from the state government who may be on the call who would like to comment or say anything regarding innovations? Okay. All right. Well, no worries. So we have a few other points which have been raised as well in the chat feature. There's a lot being asked around turbines and other questions. So any of the other panelists, if you would like to comment or highlight some of the discussion from the chat or other innovations which you think we may have missed. Joe, did you want to say something? Well, thought I saw Joe.
I think regarding V2G in Delaware, I can send you some links later to, and also okay. I'm sure Dr. Kempton can as well, because he had a little test facility on the STAR campus where there were something like 10 vehicles that were connected to the grid and acting as a power plant. So they were testing the idea of V2G at a pretty large scale, meaning that they were providing ancillary services to PJM, and they were basically acting like a power plant. So it's a very cool application that was done here at UD. Okay. So I think it would be worth it would be worth mentioning it as one of the three innovations.
Wonderful. We also had a point made by Beth regarding any pending legislations in Delaware. She has noted one that has been pending and is asking whether that will pass or not given the COVID crisis, the RPS Community Solar Bill. Are there other Delaware legislations which are pending currently that we should bring up in this conversation? JB or Phil, particularly. Phil is very active also on this. Either of you?
I'd be happy on Beth Chagis's question. And Phil, if he would like to say something, go right ahead.
Yes.
Okay. So Beth Chagis identifies a serious problem that we're going to face this spring, which is how is the legislature going to function? And that's not a small problem. What I would say is that both of these elements are combined in a single bill, the RPS Community Solar Bill. It is something that needs to be vetted with the wider community. I know that there is a very strong interest by many legislators to see this happen. And so I'm personally, but I have no crystal ball in all of this that's worth much, but I'm personally hopeful that this new approach will be acted upon by the legislature. My understanding is the way the legislature is going to focus on this issue is that there are going to be elements that are going to be folded into a bill that is multiple bills in order to reduce the amount of individual bill voting that's needed. And of course, citizens can comment on anything they want, and they may or may not survive in that pooling, but that is one technique that's being considered.
Okay. So we are, again, let me mute everyone again, we're getting feedback. Okay. We need to wrap up now, but before we do, I wanted to alert everyone to the fact that the goal of this Power Dialog is to make sure educators in high school and college can use this for their teaching purposes and to galvanize interest from students as well. So a parting thought from each of our panelists, if you would have any thoughts for students. We do have many students in the audience as well. We've had interest from public schools as well as charter schools, private schools like St. Andrews, who have said that they will be using some of this material. So what kind of advice would you have for students to get engaged in climate policy related work? Of course, there is work they can do themselves. So I'll just give you a lightning round, a minute or two each to the panelists to give some wise words to the students. So let's start off with Cristina, perhaps, since you have your own children in high school and college as well.
Oh, that's tough. I think we need to be optimistic and more positive. It's obviously a very tough fight against climate change. It's one of the most difficult challenges that we have, but it's also a wonderful opportunity. It really is. We have the technology, we have experts, we have the knowledge, we have the connectivity. Sometimes it's just, politics, it's, perceptions, but we can do it. We can do it. So let's stay positive and take that CO2 down.
Yes, definitely bend the curve. Yes. Joe, any thoughts from you on?
Yeah, I would just like to say that while climate change has received much attention, and rightly so, and that has made it a source of much controversy, but also because the impact is so severe, because it affects nearly all the sectors of the economy, but more so asset-intensive industries. Yet, while this debate continues about how to best understand and manage our systems, or in terms of the changing climate, scientists do agree that it does have an impact. And that's a message that most students, and all students indeed, should understand in terms of how, when they're making choices or in their careers, they should be able to understand that some of the industries and careers that they choose to pursue in the future are going to be affected by this issue, climate change.
Great, thank you, Joe. Phil, over to you.
So first thing you could do is vote. That's what Evan said in the introductory video, right? Vote and make this an issue.
Mm-hmm.
2, if you don't like your options when you're out voting, run for office or volunteer in your community. Yourself on a local council. They're always looking for volunteers. And 3, if that doesn't work, actually these are not mutually exclusive, then go ahead, like when Greta Thunberg organizes the next student strike, leave your classes and tell your teachers and your parents why you're doing it. So my advice to the students is to get politically active.
Wonderful. And last but not least, JB, what advice are you giving your grandkids and students and others?
So I would encourage that folks get involved and active, just as Phil was indicating. I'll offer a couple of practical strategies that include internships. We've had an internship program that we've run for a long time in the center. I know that many of the university, the School of Public, the Biden School does a lot of that too. It's open not only for university students, but also for high school students. But I think getting involved, for example, as even recommended, getting involved in the legislature and finding out how exactly these things are done. That I can assure you it's not easy, but it's also not difficult to get yourself placed in that way. And if anyone wants to try, I'm sure all of the members of the panel, but certainly Joe and I, if you'll just email us, we'll try and help you with the kind of things that you want to get involved with.
Excellent. And so, well, thanks to all of the panelists. For the audience, I'll conclude with a quotation from one of my favorite novelists, George Eliot, who wrote in her novel Middlemarch that the growing good of the world is largely made up of unhistoric acts. So much as we are looking for big historic conferences and conventions, much of the good that comes in the world is from those very small incremental efforts made by each one of us. So thanks to everyone. Please keep connected. Share the news of this session. The video will be available within the next week on the Bard College website. They have them for each state. You can also view videos from other states, and you can compare, especially our neighboring states. Pennsylvania, Penn State University hosted Pennsylvania's session. So you can view Penn State's session. You can view Maryland's session. New Jersey, others. So definitely, let's share the joy between the states. Also, some of the other international sessions which were held in Bangladesh and Brazil and elsewhere. So let's keep the momentum. This will be an annual event. Bard College hopes to do this next year as well. So stay connected, and hopefully we'll have some good news with Delaware's climate plan being implemented, a new adaptation plan perhaps in preparation, as Dr. Byrne suggested, and other happy occurrings and beyond this current crisis. So thanks everyone, and let's keep in touch. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Salim.
Bye.